program features Diane Hayes, and I'm kind of amazed that his name didn't get on here. I mean, he didn't do any of the work. Okay, you supervised though. All right, I knew you had to have a handle in it someplace. But let's please welcome Diane Hayes and her presentation of the Poor Farm.
Hi, everybody. Are we on? I wasn't close enough. Okay. I gave this talk probably about 20 years ago or so. Short-term memory. And there hasn't been much more discovered about the history of it. Personally, I find it very interesting, maybe because I lived in the house. And people would come, they would call us and, we got a story to tell you, and they come up and share their stories, share their memories. And to me, that was really, really interesting. The poorhouse or poor farms were tax-supported entities, institutions to which people were required to go to if they couldn't support themselves. This was in the mid-1800s. It's a long time ago. And before welfare, workers' comp, unemployment, and Social Security. All counties were required to have a poor farm. That's quite an undertaking right there. As I was looking up poor farms and reference materials, the term almshouse was mentioned, and then insane asylums. And I thought, what have I got myself into? In researching this history, I have read the minutes of the Meade County Commission from the time Lawrence County was divided and Meade County began in 1889. I have also reviewed several years of old newspapers starting in 1881. In the papers are examples of people found to be insane by the standards then. By today's standards, these same people would have had medical conditions treated by medication and controlled without hospitalization, confinement, or commitment. I found a report called The Almshouse, Construction and Management by Alexander Johnson, published in 1911. It was a study covering New York and Massachusetts, but the requirements were similar worldwide. Think of that, worldwide. It was recommended that the almshouse should be in the country. The reasons being that raising a large part of food supply, the labor could be partially done by the residents. There would be less waste in the kitchen, and what waste there was could be fed to the animals. Makes sense? It was also desirable to be close enough to town so travel wouldn't be a problem. It would be close enough so the public could make sure there was no physical abuse. Needs to have water supply, suggested 100 gallons per day per capita. Needs a woodlot for a source of heat. Almost all have porches or verandas for the residents. Do you know what a veranda is? It's a covered deck, covered porch. Also mentioned were the evils of promiscuity and the mingling of classes. Cottages were often used to separate the families from the singles. The study stated that feeble-mindedness is inherited. I didn't say a word. I also found a special report on county poor farms by Mrs. Ruth Dietz, director of the Division of Child Welfare, and Fern Chamberlain, a statistician, prepared in 1938. This study was primarily about children in poor farms in South Dakota. At the time, there were still 28 poor farms in existence. Meade County had 8 men, 1 woman, and no children. The county names are listed, so this would be a starting place for a statewide research project. Okay, why did we have the need for a poor farm? One individual who had drawn relief for his widowed sister and her small children presented himself as usual for her monthly allowance and was informed that in the future it would be needless, as a comfortable home had been provided where she and her offspring could find a home. What, the poor farm? And exclaimed the indigent brother. Yes, was the answer. This was in 1881. Never, was the fraternal rejoinder. I would rather support her myself, and he did. He had no objection. He could see no indelicacy in the county furnishing the means for her support, but his pride was touched when that source provided her directly with a home. Then he became indignant and performed the duty he should have done all along. Later that year, there was another case. The destitute claimant on the county's charity purchased articles that were direct luxuries, such as many a thrifty farmer's wife would buy only in a season of great prosperity. Not only did one fair sufferer buy the necessities of boots and clothing, but indulged in the luxury of an elaborate switch for her hair. This is running relief into the ground and should be stopped. Only those who are undeniably poverty-stricken and helpless should be supported by the county. In 1887, there was a bill introduced for appropriation for the erection and maintenance of an insane asylum on some tract of land near Sturgis. Our little community having an insane asylum? The records show that more insane persons have been sent and are now confined in the Yankton Asylum from the Black Hills region than from any portion of the territory, 3 times the size of this. Lawrence County alone has averaged 1 each month, a terrible showing indeed. The expense is very great, and now institutions for people of a sound or unsound mind, one at Yankton and one at Jamestown, are overcrowded. In the Jamestown Asylum, there are 140 patients, and the capacity of the institution is greatly overtaxed. At the Yankton Asylum, the authorities have notified Lawrence County to remove several incurables, and there are 3, according to reports, now awaiting action at Deadwood. So 3 more residents could be going to Yankton. Here's another article. The urgent need for an asylum. The numbers of need of this are now quite large in the Black Hills, and careful inquiry, we estimate them to present a fully 60 or 1 to every 500 of our population. That's a big number. It will grow very rapidly in the immediate coming years, and it's time to prepare and arrange for their treatment and care. In 1888, in the Sturgis Weekly Record, a farmer became deranged and was taken by his friends to the nearest point for relief. The patient is in bad condition, insane all the time, and afflicted with spasms that occur frequently. He's a married man, 35 years of age. Would that be epilepsy, or would that be something else? Later that same year, somebody was pronounced insane, but for whom no accommodations could be secured at the insane asylum at Yankton. He was turned over to his friends and taken to his home. He is epileptic, and when not suffering with a fit, is perfectly rational, kind, and industrious. Fits occur irregularly every 6 months, intervening, and when the horrors of one is thoroughly insane and demonstrative, but we understand, never vicious or dangerous. The same paper had another article. The chairman of the County Insanity Board received a letter from the superintendent of the Yankton Insane Asylum declining to receive the man who was recently judged insane. The patient was delivered to the care of the county commissioners. You never know what your job's going to entail. In 1888, again, the probate judge is in receipt of a communication from the superintendent of the Yankton Hospital for the Insane, informing him that Mrs. So-and-so, a patient from this county, is well mentally and he intends to release her. A letter has been received from the woman's husband, who emphatically declines to have anything to do with her again and has no money to contribute to her support. Guess love is over. They were married 2 years ago, and one child resulted from their union, now in possession of the father. She is a queer case. She was stubborn, refusing for days to answer a question or say a word, but was considered harmless. I guess we just can't have a mad attack. Here's another instance. The condition of mental faculties had on 3 occasions been inquired into by the Board of Insanity and was examined by the 4th on Thursday. The conclusion again reached is that the youth is sane and his release was ordered. The last charge was preferred by a brother who objected to his selling a team owned in common and using the proceeds to take a trip benefit for his health. Okay, now these are from the minutes of the commissioners, and those minutes were so interesting to read. They were handwritten in pencil, and over the years, the writing had faded quite a bit. It was a challenge, but it was sure interesting. In April of 1893, it was decided to have a county hospital to care for county charges or paupers. A 12-month lease was drawn up by with John Welke. He was to provide the building immediately north of his residence. Now, John Welke used to own the house that Bud Bikes fixed up, the stone house on Junction. The building was to be completely plastered and all partitions therein placed in accordance with understanding that this day with the Board of County Commissioners. 3 chimneys to be built in said building. A frost-proof cellar, not less than 12 by 12, to be dug under the same, and all windows, doors, and steps in same building to be maintained in suitable condition, and the roof of said building, as well as the building itself, to be properly painted, and said building in all respects should be made suitable as a county hospital. The lease shall also include the use of water, as may be in the cistern, or the use of well water on the residence of J.G. Wenicky. In July of that year, the lease was presented, read, and filed. In 1898, bids were advertised for a site for a hospital and poor farm in Meade County. Such site to be within 2 miles of the city, and bids for either 40-acre, 120, or 160-acre tracts will be entertained. The bids for the site for the county hospital and poor farms were open, and it being found that Mr. Harris Franklin of Deadwood offers to donate the 80 acres owned by him immediately north of the town site of Sturgis. His offer was accepted, and the state's attorney was instructed to procure a deed and to thank Mr. Franklin on behalf of the county. The bids for the new hospital were open. I was hoping Bob Grahams would be here. I don't see him. The bids for the new hospital, the low one was $2,639.09, and the top bid was $2,800. The bid of Nick Schumer, who presented the low bid, was accepted. Walter Scott was employed as a superintendent for construction on the hospital. When the hospital is completed, he shall receive $50 for his services. Pretty high wages. In December of 1898, the building was completed, examined, and accepted. It's 36 by 72, a story and a half with a partial basement, built out of stone, probably taken from the hill behind. I wish we had some pictures of when that was under construction. There was nothing mechanical. It was horses and human labor that put that building up, and that would have been quite a job. Bids were also accepted for cleanup, a well, an outhouse, a cistern, a windmill, fencing and gate, painting, and so forth. In 1900, a place was selected on the poor farm for burial of county dependents. Walter Scott to survey the cemetery. I do have the plat for the cemetery, but it was never recorded. They don't know for sure where it was located, but I think north of the house, north and probably a little east of the house. Okay, in 1901, a smallpox epidemic had started. A decision was made to build a small, comfortable 3-room building suitable for quarantine the possible smallpox patients. Bills were paid to 3 caregivers of smallpox patients. In April of 1902, bills were approved for 17 caregivers of smallpox patients. In June of 1902, there was a final inspection of the detention hospital, or the pest house. I am so thankful that wasn't my house. In 1904, 1 room at the county hospital was prepared to temporarily house insane patients by installing iron bars across the windows of 1 room, making it secure. In January of 1908, there was another smallpox epidemic. Bills exceeded $1,200. And that was big money back then. In 1914, Meade County entered into a contract with Henry Fruth for the east 34.5 acres of the county poor farm for $35 a year for 3 years. There's a picture over here showing most of the property of the poor farm, and that east 35 acres was left blank. That's where the pest house was, and probably where the barn was for the cow and the chicken coop, and there was a building for pigs, and these people were pretty self-reliant up there. In 1923, repairs were needed at the poor farm. New flooring inside, a 5-foot wide sidewalk along the north side was constructed to prevent water from running into the basement. A new porch, 10 by 80 foot with railing around, and 2 coats of paint was completed on the south side for $115. Do you think they got their money's worth? In 1923, later, old shingles and gutter were removed and replaced. Contract was for $422 complete. In 1923, a barn was built on the poor farm. A small piece of the property was sold. Sold the acreage to Henry Fruth and Dale Tribby. In 1932, county assistance was the highest ever. The large sums normally expended for the yearly budget had been spent in 90 days. State aid was received and used to pay workers to cut a supply of wood from the burned area of the forest. Workers also constructed some needed buildings, 4 houses containing 6 units for county dependents on the poor farm property. And you can just barely make them out in that one picture. In 1936, state aid was discontinued. In 1939, it was decided to sell the buildings and approximately 2 acres of ground known as the poor farm. The minimum value was set at $5,000. The purchaser to continue the hospital and care for the county charges. No offer was received. With just a few patients, it was decided to have care provided elsewhere. Mrs. Myers contracted care for patients in her room. The building was then rented out as a private home until 1945. At that time, most of the Poor Farm property was divided into parcels, appraised, and was sold at public auction. The hospital building and 6.77 acres sold for $2,600, which was just a tiny bit more than what it cost to build it originally. Richard, you want to click me? Okay, this is what spurred all of my research. Steve Berry was the county coroner at that time, and he came to me and he says, "What have you heard from up here?" And have you got time to research this? So that started my digging into records. This was on a 1923 fire map. It was on a calendar that the Sanborn Insurance Company put out. It shows the buildings in approximately the right positions, but those arrows are not right. They should be going straight north. Okay, Richard. This just tells a little bit about the history, which I've covered almost all of it. There has only been 5 owners of the house up to now. That's pretty good for 120, 130 years. Okay, this shows the family that rented the house originally. And this is a picture taken down by the barn. And you can see the forest of chimneys up on top. It was all heated with wood. And you can also see the way the windows were in the building. And they were remodeled and put in more modern windows after that. Here again, it shows the windows before remodeling and after. This picture, I don't know for sure when it was taken. The windows had been remodeled, so it was probably after the 50s. But you can see we have trailer homes in the yard around the house. Down here in the lower right, there's mobile homes there, and those were right in our yard. Now there's pictures over here, and it shows a cornfield in the yard, and it seems like there was something else that showed up in the yard. Now this doesn't pertain to the Poor Farm, but you can see the way the houses looked back then. And this was taken from the Nellie Street location. Over here you can see the fire tower that was behind City Hall. That's where all fire alarms went out. And over here there's a tall structure, and that's where the steam plant was located, close to the Vets Club. Okay, these are kind of interesting charts. This is a showing of the cost of burials. That includes the casket, handling the person, the body, the burial, mileage to and from, and those numbers are very interesting, I think. And over here we have the wages paid to the caretaker. Now that included all food for the residents. It included if they needed any clothing, that came out of her wages. The upkeep of the place, the personal care for all the patients. Pretty low wages. This is wages paid to workers in the county. We start out at 25 cents an hour and come up, I think people lived on that. And over here we have a list of the physician services. We had one doctor, and he took care of everybody in the county. There were lots of surgeries performed on the kitchen table. If somebody broke their leg, that included a cast, that included everything. Okay, down here at the bottom shows the outline of the original 80 acres. The part on the right side is what Dale Tribby and Henry Fruth bought, but the rest of it you can kind of see how it's been divided up into lots. That's the way it looked at one time when we had it.
Did you do the B&B too, Diana?
Yes,
Did you do that quite a while? A couple of years?
14 years.
Oh, you did, quite a while. Where exactly is this located at?
North at the community center, you can see a big building up there, and it's not too hard to spot.
If you look at that picture there, it is, you can see the pork farm. It's circled right there, kind of on the right, so it's located. It's up on a slight, I think, about a third of the way up slightly, I guess you could say.
Right.
I think this house still exists, doesn't it?
I'm sure most of them do, Ross. It would be interesting to drive around up there and try to pick them out. We've come a long ways since then.
Yeah, so except one thing, I think you forgot a story. You told me about a certain person that owned a bakery here in town.
Yes, Lil Weimer was one of the local people. He went up there and milked the cow morning and night, and he turned over so much milk for the residents of the poor farm, and then the rest of the milk he got to take home for his family. And a lot of people had stories. Right now I can't think of the individual stories, but it was amazing how the public around town took care of him, or did their best to take care of him.
For those of you that aren't aware, it's Franklin that donated the land for the poor farm, has a connection with Deadwood. If you've ever heard of the Franklin Hotel, he was the money man behind that. And also the Adams House in Deadwood was built by Harris Franklin. He was the first one that lived in that. He was a rather wealthy man in the area.
He came to the area as a liquor dealer. And during the blizzard of, 88, he bought up the surviving cattle herds and moved them to a place that he owned out by Camp Crook, and he made a few dollars there. But it was kind of interesting as a sideline. I was kind of researching his history too, and he was a very industrious fellow.
How did your family get to own this?
I bought it.
You bought it, okay.
I was looking for a place that was suitable as a bed and breakfast, and it was certainly big enough. When the realtor wanted me to go look at it, I said, I don't think so. And she says, keep an open mind. So I did, and we did, and that was how history was made.
Do you know when they all moved to Yankton? That was where eventually the state hospital ended up, was in Yankton. So did our folks in Meade County then, when the poor farm was gone, did they have to go to Yankton? Was that where they went for help?
There was very few, but there was nursing care available here. I mentioned Mrs. Myers said that she would care for people in her home.
Yeah.
Now, she also had run a maternity home, so she was experienced in taking care of people. And
Yankton State Hospital is still there. I
yes,
think. Yeah. So is Jamestown.
yes,
And I'd like that to not be true, but that's what the case
but there is a need for them.
Yes. In some cases, yes.
Hello, Diana.
Hi.
Do you recall the name of the physician that in 1945 that was treating patients?
Not unless it's on my sheet.
Okay. And I think there was also a Mrs. Martin that had a home or a facility in town.
There were quite a few ladies that had maternity homes.
Okay.
I have a list of some of them, but I could never. The people that we need to talk to get the information on them aren't with us anymore. There's people that were born there, but their memories aren't very good.
Thank you.
Okay, under the viaduct, near what was entitled Hangman's Tree, was a home, and the Nelsons have lived there, the Nelson family.
But I think that was Mrs. Myers'
That
home.
was because people said that that was the birthing at that
Right.
time. Yeah.
So what was the highest number of people that lived at that at any
I
time?
don't know for sure, but we have heard. A fellow came to see us. He had come up there and stayed with his aunt and uncle when they were running the poor farm, and he thought there was about 30 patients there. Now, where they put them, I don't know, because they must have been hanging them from the ceiling or something. The rooms that were finished off, that had been partitioned for bedrooms, there must have been 6 people to a room. I just don't know. You couldn't tell by the marks on the floor what the original was. I did try to register it with the Historical Society, and they said it had been altered too much and they weren't interested in it.
Diana,
Yes,
is it currently an active residential home?
Yes,
or
it is.
Okay. So when whoever bought it from you, are they still there, or has
Yes.
it been sold again?
no, as far as I know, they're still there.
And they live there as in
Yes.
a home?
Yes,
Okay.
no. I don't think we have a B&B in town anymore, but I'm not positive on that. It was a wonderful way to meet people.
Okay, the plot of this Poor Farm Cemetery, you said was never recorded,
Right,
but you had a copy of it.
right.
Did it list the individuals' names?
People weren't identified by name, not
Okay.
in the commissioner's minutes. I have an article that was written for the South Dakota Magazine about Yankton when they had a terrible fire there, and there were a lot of people that died. They were identified by number, never by name, because people back then just didn't want the public to know
Sure.
that their relatives were there.
Sure.
The only person that I know for sure that was buried up there in the county Poor Farm Cemetery, and there were 300 plots drawn out. But according to the graves that were recovered, I think they said there were 8 that had been recovered. And one of them had been the former mayor of, help me, Sioux Falls, Yankton, the former mayor of Yankton. And he was really down on his luck, and he came out here. He was a personal friend of Judge Ash, and they took care of him. And when he finally passed away, Judge Ash went down and was trying to take up collections for his final expenses. And Mrs. Ash stayed home to prepare the body, and he was buried. And I don't think he was buried in a casket.
Okay, so we recovered 8 bodies, and have they been reinterred?
They were reinterred at the Bear Butte Cemetery in short order after they were discovered.
Good.
And about that same time, there was a body of a child, or a casket of a child, found out in the Elm Springs area. Is that right? And there was just a couple of bones left in that casket, but it was a pretty elaborate casket. And they buried that casket. They put it inside of a new casket and buried it at the Bonita Cemetery. So everybody has been taken care of. And as long as we're talking about burials, I found out that people used to take their deceased to the school section and just bury them helter-skelter. They were never marked. There was no marked graves. During the epidemics, if somebody was out in the country and they died, they had somebody build a coffin for them, and they were buried out on the ranch. But people were pretty private back then. And there was probably a reason for it. You know, nobody needs to know all of our business.
I'm not familiar with any of this. So that article you said started the research. What is the article about? I mean, how did they unearth these remains? Who came along? Who found them?
They were building a new home up there. And as they were digging the basement, and the retaining walls, they uncovered remains. And nobody knew about them. Nobody that was still alive in our time knew about them. So this is what started the hunt. And I would guess I would rather research something with a happier ending than this. But it is part of our history.
Do you know if there were any Native Americans in this?
I have no idea who was up there.
Because I know in North Dakota, one woman whose grandchildren were taken by the state to go to a boarding school, and she was in charge of them. She could not speak English, and so she didn't understand. She thought they were kidnapped, and she went out looking for them in the Jamestown area and was picked up by the authorities, and they thought that she was insane, and she died in the Jamestown State Hospital. She lived her whole life there. And there are stories like that, but I was just wondering if you had any kind of...
The stories that I found, you heard about most of them there.
Good.
And the commissioner's minutes didn't give names.
Yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question.
Okay.
I'm struck by how many people were cared for in this way that actually did not have mental illness.
Right. Those
And-
examples that I gave, those people weren't mentally ill.
The epilepsy is not, you know, and they even commented in the one you talked about that otherwise, you know, the person is productive, and it's just, we've learned a lot. We have a ways to go yet.
Yes, we do.
But I'm just fascinated by what you have unearthed for us. Thank you.
Well, like the two brothers that couldn't get along, and they had bought a horse jointly. And one guy wanted to sell his half of the horse and the other one didn't. That doesn't make him nuts. Well, maybe it does. Probably not the head.
What was the process of deciding who goes to this facility?
People had, to the poor farm, you mean? People had to apply to the county commissioners. And then they made the decision because the county was supporting these people. And I imagine they heard some real hardship cases, and they heard about some others like what I told about today that really weren't hardship.
But the poor farms also did support those who were elderly. I have a relative that ended up at the Gayville Poor Farm, and he'd been the county treasurer for Lawrence County, but he had no money. And when he ended up with Alzheimer's and he was incontinent, the family could no longer take care of him anymore, so he was taken to the poor farm.
Right.
And then he was buried in a pauper's grave. And there were many like that that ended up in those kind of places
Right.
also.
Not too long ago, there was an article in the Black Hills Pioneer about the poor farm up at Gayville. And I didn't take time to reread it, but it tells a lot about circumstances.
On that Rapid City Journal article that you showed, what's the date on that?
2002.
2002, okay. And when you talked about a home being the basement excavated, where's that home at? Where is that?
Are you familiar with where this building is?
Not really, no.
Okay, well, it would be right up above the community center. And now it's part of the campground that's up there.
I was going to just mention in doing research, I've found out that each county had an insanity board, and people were called before the insanity board. And the worst cases were sent to Yankton. Yankton, the hospital there existed from the earliest times of Dakota Territory, and the worst cases were sent there. Oftentimes, people were deemed insane in order to kind of allow them, the poor and indigent, a place to go locally. But the worst cases were sent to Yankton.
Well, the caretaker of the poor farm wouldn't be able to handle that.
It's probably a good thing we have a better process today, because half of us would probably be up there.
It's a good thing we have the medical care now too.
So I believe you said that they closed it down in 1939.
In the late 30s, early 40s.
Well, I find that interesting in that this country went through the Great Depression, and
Prior to that.
and I don't really know a lot about how it affected people in the western part of South Dakota. A little bit more about the eastern part. My father was involved in that in Hanson County when he was a youngster. But it seems to me that there was a whole lot of people that were close to being indigent along that time in the 30s, and then yet this building didn't have any people in it anymore.
The building was rented out to private family, and then it was sold after that. This family lived there for 3 years, I believe. They had 6 kids. They needed a pretty good sized house, but I don't think in those days it was in really good shape. But the 4 cottages that were built up there on the Poor Farm property, there's 2 of those still being lived in. They have been remodeled and they're being lived in. I think 2 of them were torn down, but excuse me, they were rented out to single ladies lived there. Families, some of them were rented to families. Everybody didn't qualify for the poor farm that rented those places. But they didn't want the men in the big house and the women in the little houses to be together. It's hanky-panky.
More questions? Well, we want to thank Diane very much for excellent presentation.
The only thing, I'd like to make a couple of comments as far as segueing some stuff here, because some conversations that Diana and our committee has actually had is the maternity home was brought up, and we would like, if anybody ever finds any information, or if you're talking to maybe somebody that was born in a maternity home, just because they were born there doesn't mean they might know something about it. That is something we would like to research at some point and do a program on. And in the hospital, and I have not, this is kind of a surprise on the committee, I was in the hospital back the first part of October, and they have a really nice display in that long hallway there between the hospital and the clinic, giving a history of the hospital here in town. And eventually we'll round up a panel, and we'll have a history on the hospital in the area too. So, but I keep forgetting to talk to anybody about that. So that'll be a...
The thing that I think would make a really good presentation is the history of funerals. Not the funeral homes, but funerals. Because I mentioned that people used to take their dead to the school section to bury them. And at one time the county commissioners asked the superintendent of schools to not allow that to happen anymore. How are you going to stop it?
And I would like to, if, with your permission, I would like to show pictures of the inside of that house the way it was.
Okay.
Is that okay? I'm going to hand this off to you. And I will click, because it's beautiful inside, or at least there's that fireplace. We got more. Come on, come more. There we go. Is that a cloud bathtub?
Clawfoot, yes. I found it upside down, and it's somebody's yard up at Vale.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't original.
No. Is this better, Ross?
Yeah.
So you just never know where you're going to find old things, but that tub upside down in that guy's yard, and the inside of it was in good shape.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
I did have it repainted, but it was in good shape. It wasn't all chipped up and banged up, or wasn't being used as a horse trough.
All right.
Well, thank you all for coming.
There's a panoramic picture over here of Sturgis, probably prior to 1935, because the city armory isn't in it. And you can spend days and days looking at it.